So this week we are finishing our series on Joseph. So we're going to reach the climax of the story, if you like. Just to give you a little bit of a recap of where we're up to now. So Joseph was one of 12 brothers, and he lived in Canaan, which is modern day Palestine. And he was sold as a slave by his brothers into Egypt. And then as a slave, he was badly treated and accused in a sense and thrown into prison. And then whilst in prison, he used his gift given to him by God of interpreting dreams. And then a few years later, Pharaoh heard about this, and he wanted his dreams to be interpreted. So he got Joseph out of prison, and Joseph, with God's help, was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And after that, because Pharaoh was now pretty happy, he arranged for Joseph to be made the prime minister, the governor of the land. And his role was to, using his organisational skills, his natural talents that God had given him, he was put in charge of the land during the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And so his role was to make sure that they kept plenty of grain from the plentiful years to feed the people in the 7 years of famine that followed. Now, all the meanwhile, we have Jacob and his brothers who are still in Canaan, his 11 brothers. And they too are affected by this famine. And so much so that one day actually Jacob turns to the brothers, a bit like a dad sometimes does, and says this. He says, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? Go down to Egypt and buy some of this grain for us so that we may live and not die." And so this is what actually happens in today's story, is that the brothers leave Canaan and head to Egypt. But Jacob says to them, "You can all go, but you cannot take Benjamin." Now, Benjamin wasn't involved in any of the debacle of Joseph being sold as a slave into Egypt. He was the youngest. And he also shared the same mum as Joseph. They were full brothers, if you like. And it's interesting, isn't it, that even now Jacob still seems to have his favourites. And so much so he wouldn't let them take Benjamin. But the other brothers all go to Egypt in search of grain. And of course, when they get to Egypt, they go to buy some grain from the governor. And the governor that is selling the grain is, of course, Joseph. Now, Joseph recognises his brothers, but they don't recognise him. It's probably not surprising in a way, because I would imagine Joseph would have been in quite fine clothes, possibly a headdress. He'd have been quite a few years older, but also they really weren't expecting to see him, and certainly not in such a position of authority. So they didn't recognise him, but he does recognise them. And he probably, I can't imagine what he would have been thinking in that moment. But he actually speaks quite harshly to them. And he says this, he says, "Where do you come from?" And he then actually accuses them of being spies. He's probably trying to wrestle with how to deal with this situation, and he's probably all sorts of emotions are coming flooding through, and he accuses them of being spies. Maybe he's trying to buy a bit of time, or just trying to work out how to deal with this situation. And they try to defend themselves, and they go on to explain that their father and their brother are back home in their homeland. And so Joseph then goes on and throws one of the brothers, Simeon, into prison. And demands that they go back to their home country. If they want grain, they've got to go back to their home country and bring this other brother, Benjamin, back to them. And so that's what they do. They go back home to their father Jacob, and they explain to their dad what has happened. And Jacob is really not very happy with this, and he refuses to let Benjamin go back to Egypt with them. He's really scared that something is going to happen to his now favourite son. But after a while, hunger gets the better of Jacob, and eventually he does relent. And he says, okay, you can go back to Egypt and you can take Benjamin to get some grain. But very interestingly, Judah, who is the oldest brother, he actually takes responsibility at this point. And we see a very, very different Judah now and going forward to the Judah who many, many years ago was part of the gang that had Joseph sold. And Judah says this, he says, I myself will guarantee his safety. That's Benjamin's safety. You, Jacob, Dad, can hold me personally responsible for him. I will bear the blame for him if something happens to him all of my life. So they go back to Egypt and back to Joseph, this time with Benjamin. And as they meet again, this time with Benjamin, there's a really moving part in the story. So this is 22 years after Joseph would have seen his brother Benjamin, and he meets him again. And it says this, deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. But the brothers still at this point don't realise that this is Joseph. And in a sense, Joseph now tests his brothers. Maybe he wants to really find out where they are, if they really are sorry. And so what he does is he arranges for them to have their sacks filled with grain, the grain that they've indeed come for. But as well as that, he arranges for his own silver cup to be planted, to be placed in Benjamin's sack without Benjamin knowing. And they set off to go back to Canaan. But actually, after a while, he asks one of his stewards to go after them and to accuse them of stealing his silver cup. And of course, when he asks to search their sacks, he finds it in Benjamin's sack. And the brothers are terrified. They are hauled back to Joseph and worried. They're really worried that they're all going to now be made slaves because of what has happened. And Joseph says, don't worry, only the one of you who has stolen my cup will be made a slave. Well, of course, it's Benjamin who's allegedly stolen the cup. And Judah is really, really worried at this point as to what is going to happen to Benjamin, because he's promised his dad that he will look after him. He's promised him that he will protect him. And Judah says this. Judah says, now then, please let your servant remain here as the Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? Do not let me see the misery that will come on my father. So here we come to the climax, in a sense, of the story, where we've now got Benjamin, who's been accused of stealing Joseph's silver cup. Judah takes it upon himself, what a changed man he is, takes it upon himself to step in and offer himself instead of Benjamin to be a slave. So, don't forget, at this point in the story, the brothers still don't know who Joseph is. So we're now going to watch a video clip to see what happens next.